Hi, everybody. I'm Claire Johnson, and I know some of you. And I work in online sales, in the sales organization. And I'm very excited to introduce one of our authors at Google Speakers, because she is a friend of mine. And Amy and I went to business school together now a long time ago, which is like shocking to me now. And I will say that one of the things that if you've heard anything about her book or read the bio in the announcements about this talk, is Amy is true to her background, which is a highly creative, versatile person who proves that an MBA is not a death sentence on your creativity or your ability to think across functions. And what I would say is if you think about what she's done before business school, working in museums, and then after working both in very unique finance companies as well as getting an art degree I think in painting, as well as doing some work again, but more on the strategy side for the Tate in London, I think you'll see that she shows sort of a proof that you can move around and probably add a lot of value because you're breaking down a silo across organizations. And one of the things I think we try to do at Google, and I think largely we're successful, but sometimes we're not, is to think beyond our current place, whether that's with a product or when we think about innovation and how we reach our advertisers in a lot of dimensions. So I think what Amy is going to do today is give a little bit of a talk that she has tailored for this Google audience, and also then read from Museum Legs, which is her latest project, in addition to some other side projects that she was filling me in on last night. And I would just say there are people you'll meet in your life who make you think differently and ask you questions that make you reconsider sort of your worldview, and Amy is one of them, and I hope, and I imagine she will do that for all of you today. So with that, Amy Whitaker, author of Museum Legs.
Thanks so much for being here. Thanks, Pepe and everyone else for hosting me, and thanks, Claire, for the kind introduction. I would say likewise, if you decide to go to business school, you show up and there are people there and you think, wow, do I get to go to business school with people like this? And Claire is definitely that person. So I am going to talk a little bit about a book called Museum Legs, and I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background on why I wrote the book and contextualizing it in a larger concept of art and creativity. If at any point I'm hard to hear, just raise a hand, please, and I'll speak up. So I started writing this book many, many millions of years ago, just out of business school, when I noticed two different things happening at the same time. One is that, this is around 2001, museums were expanding architecturally at record rates, and they also had record-breaking numbers of visitors. At one point in time, there were 52 pending expansion projects in the United States alone that would have added 4 million square feet of exhibition space at a combined cost of $4 billion, which is, I think, double the operating budget of the 200 largest museums in the United States. So I was noticing this at the same time. Every time I took my friends to museums, they looked a little bit more like this. So this is a classic case of numbers or success metrics on the one hand and stories or experiential knowledge on the other. And I wanted to be able to reconcile these things. And the first thing I learned is that museum fatigue is not a new concept at all. There's a wonderful man named Benjamin Ives Gilman who wrote a book in 1918 called Museum Ideals of Purpose and Method, and he devoted an entire chapter to seats as preventatives of fatigue. These wicker stools he thought everyone should carry around. These are images illustrating the fact that artwork is often hung at the wrong height. He made an observation that still holds true, that museums are one of the only areas of modern life where you are asked to stand to concentrate and to sit to rest. Offices, cinemas, theaters are all different from that. And the question remains, how would you design a museum that has original works of art where people could actually sit in front of them and you could have more than 5 people in a gallery at the same time? If you know an answer to that, let me know. I haven't figured it out myself. So I decided, given this conundrum, that I would write not for the policy architects of museums, but for people who go to them. I thought that the fact my friends were getting bored and tired in museums might be a marker of what is essentially political disenfranchisement, this idea of feeling a little bit left out of a conversation around especially contemporary art. So the book took this form as academically researched. I was lucky to have a Harvard library card at the time I started, but also written in this more anecdotal, personal format. So skepticism toward modern art is nothing new. It's been around as long as modern art has been in the United States. It made its debut in what's called the Armory Show in 1913, when a bunch of people who'd seen groundbreaking modern work in Europe decided to bring it to New York. This is what the installation of the show looked like. And it was so controversial at the time that Theodore Roosevelt, among others, took the time to write about it. And I want to read a quick passage of what Theodore Roosevelt wrote. He, as you might imagine, is a very gracious man, so he thanked the organizers profusely and then went on to say that, quote, the lunatic fringe was fully in evidence. The Cubists are entitled to the serious attention of all who find enjoyment in the colored puzzle pictures of the Sunday newspapers. There is no reason why people should not call themselves Cubists or octagonists or Knights of the Isosceles Triangle or Brothers of the Cosine if they so desire. As expressing anything serious or permanent, one term is as fatuous as another. He went on to compare the now iconic painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2, unfavorably to a Navajo rug in his own bathroom. If he wanted to call the rug a well-dressed man going up a ladder, the name would in fact fit the facts just about as well as in the case of the Cubist picture of the naked man going downstairs. From the standpoint of terminology, each name would have whatever merit inheres in a rather cheap, straining after effect. And from the standpoint of decorative value, of sincerity, and of artistic merit, the Navajo rug is infinitely ahead of the picture. So this kind of skepticism still exists. This is a work by Joseph Beuys called Lightning Stagg. I have the dubious distinction of having accidentally seen almost every version of it in the world. This is it up close. I have a friend who refers to it as an Olympic turd. And these are people in the installation. This is Lightning Stagg over here. So these are the people that the book is really for. And if you're asking a question of why museums bore or tire people, what you're really asking is why that matters. No one would write or read a whole book about tiredness by definition. And to me, it matters for two other reasons. And one is the political life of museums as institutions, and the other is the widespread presence of creativity as a basic human attribute. So I like to call these the first principles of art: visual thinking, imagination, and creativity. Visual thinking. We live in one of the most visually overwhelming cultures of all time. We're constantly making sense of the built environment. We even create machines that can read things like this, and machines that can read things like this. They scan for zip codes, and where they fail, there are people who have crazy brains that remember all of the zip codes in the United States, and they serve the same function. This, conversely, is from a company that will hand address junk mail so that it gets opened. So then we're having to decide if this looks like someone we know sent it or it looks like a magazine subscription offer. In fact, almost everything that exists in the world, with the exception of abstract expressionist paintings, is drawn before it comes into existence. This is a Rubik's Cube. Almost every patent application has an attached drawing. This is the 1939 Museum of Modern Art building. MoMA is probably one of the great art projects of the 20th century. It was founded by 3 women who met by accident and opened the doors 10 days after the stock market crash of 1929. Between 1929 and 1939, they didn't have a permanent home. That's the model for the building. And a lot of people will say, I'm not really an artist. I can't draw a stick figure. These are, I think, exquisite stick figures by an artist, David Shrigley. And if you really think that you can't draw, consider that you have a signature. So one of the most basic parts about drawing is that it requires present-mindedness of actually noticing the world around you of actually looking at a vase well enough to draw the specific contour of it. And one of the things that noticing and present-mindedness allows is innovation, essentially imagining relative to what's there, what's possible. And the example I'm using here of imagination is a man named Roger Bannister. Some of you probably know who he is. Roger Bannister was the first person to run a mile in under 4 minutes. At the time he did it, in May of 1954, people thought it was physically impossible, as if a law of nature that you could not run that fast. He did it with help from his friends and a lucky day of weather and last-minute encouragement from a coach he happened to bump into. And after he did it, he only held the record for 45 days before he was beat by a bunch of other people. And now the current world record in the mile is 3 minutes and 46 seconds. So there's this kind of basic notion of progress that something seems absolutely impossible, someone demonstrates it, and then a lot of people best that effort. Another example of imagination, this is a man named George Fairchild. George Fairchild grew up in a very poor sharecropping family and reinvented himself a number of times over, first as a publishing executive and then as the chairman of the company that became IBM. So in 1916, when he was the chairman of IBM, the company was first listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So imagine the feeling of being at a pinnacle of achievement at that point, and then imagine how much technology and IBM has changed since then. So imagination and creativity have this notion of a kind of point in time at which someone is making a creative work, but a much longer arc of how that might be interpreted. And museums are often kind of taking the more aerial view, as opposed to the person in the woods staring at a tree view of creativity, where you're often appreciating something from a great distance. And this is just a reminder that that creativity and imagination they're everywhere, and they're a lot messier and unpredictable than one might think looking at them in hindsight. And just as one more example, some of you I'm sure know this man better than I do. This is Whitfield Diffie. He's the computer scientist who is largely credited with inventing public-private key encryption. And what I really appreciate about his story is that Diffie, first of all, didn't learn to read until he was 10 years old, and then it wasn't seen as a big deal. He plowed through a book and subsequently learned about ciphers in the 5th grade and took a great interest in cryptography when he was an adult. He read a 1,200-page book called The Code Breakers and then spent 1973 driving around the country in a Datsun 510 visiting libraries, this is pre-internet, to read all the books he could find on encryption. He ended up in the Stanford campus, had a half-hour meeting that led to a research appointment and a PhD application, and he had all this training in what is essentially the craft of computer science. He'd studied artificial intelligence. But the actual moment of creative breakthrough came in May of 1975 when he was living in the house of a professor, John McCarthy, also an artificial intelligence pioneer, acting as a quote-unquote house husband, taking care of McCarthy's daughter. So this is how this breakthrough is described. Diffie's routine at the time was to fix Mary, his wife, whom he met on the Datsun drive-thru, breakfast before she went to work at her job analyzing geologic findings at British Petroleum. Then he would spend the rest of the day alternating between domestic chores and research. Sometime during that afternoon, he altered the course of cryptography by splitting the key. So this is Diffie talking about his experience. The thing I remember distinctly is that I was sitting in the living room when I thought of it the first time, and then I went downstairs to get a Coke, and I almost lost it. I mean, there was this moment when I was thinking about something, what was it? And then I got it back and didn't forget it. So this is the notion of creativity that I think is so important, and that is what museums are important in relation to. And I just want to, I'm going to keep showing this to replicate my own experience of bumping into it in museums all over the world. So the thing about this work is that the artist Joseph Beuys is the person who most famously said that everyone is an artist, and that comment can seem a little bit rich coming from someone who mostly worked in felt and lard, this piece accepted. But I think that there's a lot of truth in it, and I want to just go through 2 examples before I read a passage from the book. So does anyone know who this is a picture of? It's Winston Churchill. He's a person who liked to smoke a cigar while painting. So we think of Winston Churchill as a savior of the free world because of his role as the Prime Minister and Minister of Defense during World War II. In 1915, he left a job as the First Lord of the Admiralty. He truly thought his career in politics was over, and he took up painting as a hobby. Here he is again. I love the cigar. And these are what his paintings looked like. And he says, he wrote an essay called Painting as a Pastime, and I'm just going to read a short bit starting from here. I hope this is modest enough because there is no subject on which I feel more humble or yet at the same time more natural. I do not presume to explain how to paint, but only how to get enjoyment. Do not turn the superior eye of critical passivity upon these efforts. Buy a paint box and have a try. It would be a sad pity to shuffle or scramble along through one's playtime with golf and bridge, pottering, loitering, shifting from one heel to the other, wondering what on earth to do, as perhaps is the fate of some unhappy beings, when all the while, if you only knew, there is close at hand a wonderful new world of thought and craft, a sunlit garden gleaming with light. So I think that, again, this point in time of creativity, Churchill had no idea that his life would probably be his greatest work of art, and that 25 years after he left this position, he would be called to so much more governmental duty. And I think all of us probably have that kind of elastic possibility, but it's hard to be reminded of it all the time. This is Alfred Barr, also a consummate artist. Alfred Barr happens to be the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art. He was chosen when he was 27 years old, and they plucked him out of a teaching job at Wellesley College. He was recommended by a man named Paul Sachs, who used to teach a legendary connoisseurship class at Harvard. Paul Sachs happens also to have been a retired Goldman Sachs partner who was related to both Goldman and Sachs. Alfred Barr essentially fashioned an entire museum from scratch, working closely with these 3 women who are the founders. He modeled the multi-departmental plan after the syllabus of his own course. And he was so pioneering that in 1943, they stone cold fired him. They thought he was not being enough of a scholar when in fact he was being a professional manager. Barr had such loyalty to the institution, he stayed on at half his salary and a title of director of collections. And they much later realized what he had done and honored him. But he basically created an institution that grew to a public scale, and I'll just give you 2 quick examples of that. MoMA has one of the best-known photography departments in the world. The way the photography department actually came about, and I say this to people who work for one of the most creative startup companies of our generation. There was a man named Beaumont Newhall who was hired in as the librarian. Beaumont Newhall wasn't getting paid very much, and so Barr used to give him extra work taking installation photos. So every time they had an exhibition, he'd go around and take a picture of the gallery itself. So they didn't have a dark room. Beaumont Newhall used to develop the film in the men's room of the townhouse where they were. And one day, Barr came up to him and said, "What do you think about trying to host a photography exhibition?" Long story short, Beaumont quickly realized he was being tapped to organize it, and then it went well, and he became the founding director of the department. The second story is that in 1957 or 58, the MoMA building actually caught on fire. I have a picture of this. And while members of the trustees and senior staff were in standard issue fire brigade helmets, members of the public were standing across the street, and as a couple of people were called, they would unsolicitedly walk over and deposit $1 or $5 on the membership desk and then leave. And that kind of public sentiment toward museums has probably not been engendered in this country for a long time. So the public sentiment and this notion of trust in museums is what this passage I'm about to read is about. So this is a piece from a chapter called "The Insulated Judiciary." And I'll read several pages and then break and then read a little bit from the epilogue of the book. Can I switch microphones midstream? Okay. Can you all hear me on this? I'm sorry? Oh. Okay. There are few things in life that can be counted upon, but one of them is that if you are in a museum standing in front of a work by Lucio Fontana, someone will probably be standing next to you saying, anyone can paint that. Of course, the person is using the term paint loosely. Many of Fontana's finest pieces are not exactly painted per se. They consist of canvases stretched over a frame, left raw or coated in a solid color, and then slit with a knife. The canvas spreads and folds back at the slits a little like a loaf of bread dough about to be put in the oven. Fontana's pieces are lightning rods, seemingly put there to collect stray skepticism toward abstract art. To its credit, Fontana's work exhibits fastidious craftsmanship. It is harder than it looks to slit a canvas that neatly or to paint it that uniformly. But his work still falls into a long line of inadvertent rebuttals to the idea that technical mastery, especially of a representative nature, is required to make art. As Ben Lewis, a commentator for the Evening Standard, once phrased it in a review titled "A Lesson in Art History from Mrs. Blobby," a whole subgenre of art has appeared which trades on the fact that it looks as if it has been tipped out of a rubbish sack while making important philosophical statements about the nature of creativity, the myth of the artist's genius, and the act of creation. In the case of artworks that most elicit a speechless, "What the?" why does a museum choose to own them? And what are the grounds for the visitor's confidence in the museum's judgment? The viewer's trust in the museum is the springboard for the museum's educational mission. Trust is what makes the viewer patient, as if in a principle of physics, the steadier the base, the further the cantilever can extend, meaning the greater the center of gravity of trust, the greater the range of comfort and experimentation with uncomfortably new art. In the fall of 1997, I took my parents to the Museum of Modern Art to see On the Edge, contemporary art from the Werner and Elaine Danheiser collection. For purposes of this story, it is important to characterize my parents as above all patient people, academics in specialized fields with a Herculean tolerance for things that take a long time to understand, and indulgent in experiencing their children's professional lives. So I had visited the show the day before with a friend who was installing it, and I had been struck by how majestic the art looked when all of the cranes and the art handlers were still around. Messy and real in the Velveteen Rabbit sense. It was not suffering the false appearance of ease that a pristine art installation shares with a world-class figure skater or an extremely well-groomed person. The tour began with two paintings that could best be described compositionally as doodles, the swirly kind you would make if your Bic pen were running out of ink, except blown up 4,000%. The scribble paintings were decidedly unexpressive. I was unsure if this was the point. Equipped with this knowledge, a term I use loosely, we rounded the corner past neon signs by Bruce Nauman. These were at once totally intelligible, words that light up, and completely foreign. Why these words? Beyond the Nauman, we proceeded past what in a horror movie would be the first nearly overlooked sign of impending disaster. It was a leg sticking out of the wall, about a foot above the floor, made of strangely translucent wax and covered meticulously with leg hair. It had a shoe and sock on one end and a trouser leg disappearing into the wall at the other. The sock and trouser hem framed that snippet of skin you would see if someone in a suit was wearing short socks and crossed his legs. Before I had time to process this image fully, we wandered into the Jeff Koons room. I knew Koons's early work, consisting of vacuum cleaners lit up majestically with fluorescent tube lights and displayed in the vacuum seal of perfect lucite boxes. To pay for the Hoovers, the artist had famously worked as a commodities trader, a job second in iconic status only to his stint selling memberships at the Museum of Modern Art. He still claims the record for having sold the most. He is perhaps better known for his subsequent work, the gigantic topiary puppy outside the Guggenheim Bilbao, his Banality series sculpture of Michael Jackson and his pet chimpanzee Bubbles, or the photographs of him and his then wife engaging in various sex acts against My Pretty Pony cotton candy backdrops. I would show obscene work here, but it didn't seem merited relative to the need for the example. The cumulative effect of doodles, neon signs, and a wax leg was already overloading our brains and slowing down our pace when we swiveled around, and there it was, the pièce de résistance. We all stared for a moment. My clinician father, no stranger to thorough analysis and nimble intuition, turned to me. Pausing for a moment with that non-judgmental air of a parent surveying a child's abstract art project, he asked in a kind and curious tone, "So, Amy, why are the basketballs floating in the fish tank?" The short answer was that I had absolutely no idea. I could see that there were 3 of them, that their demi-submersion formed a kind of composition against the half-full tank. We could see the NBA branding, a few incongruities, some evidence of formalism. Yet we were in exactly that cantilevered moment of deciding whether to trust the museum, to call a bluff, or to say uncle and end the mental arm wrestle and adjourn to the cafe. This was exactly when trust in the museum mattered, as if that trust were an instruction from a judge to us as the jury about granting the museum generosity on the burden of proof. As in, be compassionate. This work is new to the museum too. This kind of compassion is often inversely proportionate to how arrogant or extortionate or pretentious the voice of that presentation is. If the museum has spoken with intellectual empathy in the spirit of conversation, I wipe my eyes, resign myself to the dull headache, and reboot to try again. In this case, abject confusion coincided with admiration for the curator, and so I purchased a copy of the exhibition catalog on our way out of the museum. As I sat down with the book and a bracing cup of coffee, I saw that MoMA's then chief curator, Kirk Varnadoe's warm introduction had given us some retroactive fair warning. Quote, "To its great credit, this collection seems to have nothing easy about it." Rob Storr, the curator of the exhibition, had written the bulk of the catalog, an alphabetized collection of essays about the artists. It seemed that the wax leg could have been foreboding after all, as Storr writes, and I quote, "A work of art by Robert Gober is a true or false question for which the only adequate answer is anxious indecision, since the exquisite falsehood of the objects that provoke this response is also the purveyor of basic disquieting emotional truths. Even the title of the wax leg, untitled, was disquieting. No mask for the list of materials: wax, cotton, leather, human hair, and wood." Storr himself is trained as a painter, and so is someone I trust implicitly to elucidate difficult art. And I'll just tell a couple of quick stories summarizing. Some of these are in the text. I had a friend who was his personal assistant, and she bet me once to get his autograph because he was doing a program with the artist Chuck Close, and swarms of people were asking for Chuck Close's autograph, and he was just sitting there by himself. And the reason the joke was funny is that he'd just come off of a red-eye flight and was probably delighted to sit by himself. So I didn't have any paper and took up a copy of this book I had just bought called Teach Yourself Postmodernism, part of the same series as Teach Yourself Bridge, which I also own. And he looked at it and said, "I didn't write this book." And I said, "Well, it's a guide to postmodernism. It would be appropriate if you signed it." And he signed it Pierre Maynard, a.k.a. Robert Storr, which is a reference to a Borges story about an author whose work coincides word for word with a whole section of Don Quixote by Cervantes. I don't know anyone who makes pithy Borges references when jet-lagged, apart from Rob Storr. He also, I think, loves art enough that you'll see him at exhibition openings at the Museum of Modern Art. He's also currently the dean of the art school at Yale. And I saw him most recently at an open studio for a long-time MoMA art handler. So these are the guys who take the painting out of the crate and put it on the wall. And Rob Storr is the kind of guy who shows up to see their art. So I trust him personally. I think he's incredibly intelligent and a very decent man. But personal trust is a little bit of a straw man when you're talking about an art museum. It's like saying you trust the government because your best friend from high school happens to be the president. And what you're really striving for is a sense of institutional trust. So the chapter kind of goes on to describe the time of the Founding Fathers as a golden age of innovation. not in the fine arts directly, but in the exceptionally creative act of fashioning a constitutional government from scratch. I'll just... So I think everyone here can, however rustily, remember 6th grade civics class where you study that, in fact, there's a separation of powers. So this is obviously how our American democracy is structured, but there are a lot of other things that have a similar separation of powers. It's the same way that back office accounting teams and third-party auditors are separate from traders, or how in the case of a film, you might have separate screenwriters, directors, and editors. And that can definitely work magnificently, but you might also end up watching an actor, director, editor, writer whose on-screen girlfriend laughs at all his jokes and is 20 years his junior. This is a bit unfair. So the thesis here is that in relation to this larger definition of art that I went through before with the visual thinking and imagination and creativity, museums have a capacity to be an insulated judiciary, a bit the same way that the Supreme Court is separate. Everyone who runs museums wears black, but not the same kind of outfits. And what I'm really trying to say is that museums can function a lot the way libraries do. And this is an old-fashioned and radical way of thinking, because a lot of people, like myself, who have MBAs, go work in museums and apply business thinking to the management of nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits, by definition, are market failures. There's some reason that we believe they should exist, apart from their making money directly by virtue of their activities. They make money through donations and foundation support and other means. So the bottom line is that museums they compete with leisure activities for people's time, but they'll never compete apples to apples with cinema or shopping or anything else. And that, in fact, the only difference between what they do and what libraries do is that books are by nature private goods economically, and paintings are by nature public goods. So if you put together an exhibition, many people can enjoy it at the same time. It's a high fixed cost activity, but very few people try to read lots and lots of books at the same time. One person's enjoyment of a book takes away from another person's enjoyment. People use them one at a time. So what I'm trying to say is that we can embrace this public role of museums, circa the Museum of Modern Art and the fire, and people feeling this desire to give money to it, as opposed to the current state of those institutions. MoMA was among the ones in 2000 that had huge architectural expansions, and when they opened in 2004, they increased the admissions charge 67% to be $20. There is an artist who suggested people bring the $20 in pennies, which would weigh about 12.5 pounds. But there's a trend where things that start as creative projects then become public, and then once they're public, there's an inertia toward becoming commercialized, and there's this active creative reinvention that has to happen to go back to this first stage of recreating in order to maintain oneself as a public institution. And I think this is the same thing that happens to successful artists and to successful companies as well. The market would encourage you to keep producing the same thing, essentially becoming a branded commodity product, as opposed to constantly reinvent. So you can imagine that U2 has a successful first or second album, and that they're pressured by record producers to continually produce work that sounds the same, or artists are to produce work that looks the same so that it's recognizable on an art market. And that the trick is to kind of maintain the liveliness of an existing institution, and that's not easy to do. So I'll just read a bit of the conclusion of this chapter. The insulated judiciary is not something we can do without, because it alone is what creates a sense of trust in museums. If trust erodes, superficial spectacle can intercede as an attempt to shore up the institution when the underlying substance has gone awry. And the pursuit of spectacle for its own sake damages the credibility of museums and hampers, in A Boy Who Cried Wolf way, the pleasures of spectacle when it arises naturally on its own. For example, when the winner of Tate's Turner Prize is genuinely and wholeheartedly a married cross-dresser in a taffeta baby doll dress elaborately embroidered with a miniature penis motif. This is a vase by the artist in question, Grayson Perry. This is Grayson Perry dressed up with his wife and child. Here he is with his art. Here he is making his art. I don't think he's trying. I don't think the spectacle in this case is like a sugar high. I think it's integral to his work, and there's a need to protect that. A market favors spectacle because it brings people in like a flash of light, but ultimately it kind of cheapens the experience that everyone has. This is a picture of Alfred Barr at the end of his career, and I'll just read a quotation from Nicholas Sirota, the director of the Tate, that I think applies to Barr's life and to the art. Essentially, this is a plea for patience, that your skepticism will gradually diminish and your fear will turn to love. All art was modern once. So if I can just go from this sort of critique of museums to a little bit more of what I hope happens with them. The metaphor in the book for how museums are in relation to the leisure industry is that if you're trying to compete apples to apples with film or anything of that ilk, it's a bit like watching little kids on a soccer field where everyone goes to where the ball is because that's where the excitement is, instead of saying open for a pass. I also think if museums are planning to expand architecturally, they can have more space for people to make art. I would love for more people to feel invited, not just to participate in a conversation around art, but to identify with the artists whose work is in museums, and some practical knowledge of making work is important. The same way that playing a musical instrument makes it more interesting to listen to music. I think you can understand the architecture of something by trying to do it, even at the most basic level. So I'm a huge proponent of everyone having an opportunity to be an artist. So I'll just read a little bit more from the epilogue of the book, and there's no spoiler here, and then I'll open it up to questions. I started to write this book because I wanted to figure out why museums bore my friends at the same time that visual thinking, a main attribute of art, is omnipresent. This question is a subset of a larger, more philosophical one that only yields to an indirect approach. What is art, and how do people have it in their lives? As I write, I am sitting in La Rumerie in Paris, where a friend suggested coming for hot, milky things, that which I have learned upon sitting down is actually La Rumerie, as in rum. To my left, two elegant, slightly older women fold in on their table in conversation. To my right, glamorous Parisians banter in wicker chairs. We are surrounded by tribal art, Caribbean music, and a generally happy, almost transporting feeling. It would be possible to hang out in a place like this your whole life and never go to a museum and have a lively and creative sense of the world. And that kind of awareness is, to me, either the definition of art or art's more basic reason for being. But Paris being an art capital and myself being a museum person, I went out in the afternoon to the Musée d'Orsay, the converted train station, where a disproportionate number of the world's great Impressionist paintings live. Upon arrival, I trundled down the main atrium to Edward Manet's massive canvas, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. I was lost in thought, looking at the painting from point-blank range, when a young woman tapped me on the shoulder. Holding a camera in one hand, she asked me in the less polite verb form to get out of the way so that she could take a photograph. I obliged, wondering why she didn't just buy a postcard. Did she want to see the painting or to have a record of it for later? She called to mind a line from an Italo Calvino short story from 1955, The Adventures of a Photographer. It is only when they have the photos before their eyes that they seem to take tangible possession of the day they spent. The rest can drown in the unreliable shadow of memory. The only concrete definition of art I have ever encountered was written by lawyers working for shipping and insurance companies. Clauses about originality, read irreplaceability, as pertains to decorative objects that hang on walls. At that particular point in time, art was what Federal Express would ship internationally, but UPS would not. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger wrote that a work of art is that which not only creates something new, but creates the new world in which that thing can exist. By that definition, the change in fundamental structure of global warfare after 9/11 and the world's response would both qualify as art, a new thing that changes the world to make room for itself. The question becomes, is inventive national security policy art? Michelangelo did, after all, build defense walls in addition to painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The rebuttal comes from Bob, a proprietor of a used furniture store that used to have a charming sign, "We're cheaper than we look," who eyed me once and said, "You're not going to tell me everything's art. That cabinet is art. Legislation is art." Well, actually, Bob, I am. It's not that everything is art, but that it could be. So with that, I'll close and happily take any questions from the audience. Yes?
So, from my experience of going to museum, I always find audio guide to be a very good tool to enrich my experience, especially for contemporary art. There's so much ideological concept behind, so audio guide can totally help. But I also noticed only a very few people use it, and maybe because it's easily 30% of the admission price. So I'm wondering if you know or if there's any tool being developed to enrich viewers' experience and also in a cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Right, so you're asking about people's experience of audio guides and the economics. Yeah, so this is a really interesting question of how people have complementary information. There's a chapter in the book called The Revenge of the Homunculus. Claire is actually in it. That's about that word appearing in a wall label and about this whole question of how museums talk to visitors. So there is a lot of innovation happening at the moment in that field. The North Carolina Museum of Art is opening a new building in the spring, and they've very consciously gotten their most senior curators to record audio guides that sound conversational, as if you were just walking around with the person. Other museums are figuring out how to have it be more casual, so to be a number that you can punch in on your cell phone so that you don't have to pay such a steep price. And I think what I hear from people a lot is that they really need that information, especially in the case of modern art, but that what's more compelling than someone saying how important a work is someone telling you the story of the artist. So you can relate to this person who actually made something and was compelled for a reason, whether economic or innate, to create a work of art. It's kind of what happened from the blank canvas point of view. So I would agree with you, the economics are off, and I think what happens in a lot of other media industries may happen to audio guides, where people realize how cheap the underlying technology is and either try to produce it in-house, which a lot of museums do, or it gets priced out, or I don't want to say pirated, because I don't think that would exactly, there's too much research required. I personally think it would also be wonderful if when you bought your tickets to go to a museum exhibition, or when you planned to, you could go on the website ahead of time, the way that you print a boarding pass to take a plane flight, and you could print the material and take it with you so that you don't have to walk over to the wall and read the label. There's a passage in Revenge of the Homunculus about a reporter who clocked people in exhibitions to see how long they looked at the art, and they spent 50 seconds reading the wall label and 4 seconds looking at the art. But I think you're kind of getting at this underlying issue of open-ended curiosity in looking at art and trying to understand the importance of something and to appreciate it. And one of the appreciation is more in the mode of an art historian or a critic's point of view, and open-ended curiosity is more identifying with the artist. Yes?
I really like your point about people experiencing art and making museums more accessible. I was reading, we had the anecdote about Whitaker who started out in art class,
Mm-hmm.
just transformed into a gaming class,
Mm-hmm.
and how much more successful that was. Are there any existing really successful examples you have of that, where museums kind of really invite people in to create art, and how that really increases people's engagement with the material or the other exhibitions in the museum?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a lot of, so this is a question about, I'm supposed to repeat the questions for the benefit of anyone watching this later. I can hear you loud and clear. This is a question about whether there are any good examples of museums currently bringing people in to feel a sense of creative ownership and making work in the gallery. There's a story in the book in a chapter called On Boredom about a group of miners in the north of England who started making their own art. It's one of my favorite stories in the book. So yes, there are a lot of museums who have interesting art-making activities. Most of them tend to be geared toward children. And they do have art-making classes for adults. And at one point I looked at the offerings of the Museum of Modern Art, and all of the studio classes were sold out well ahead of time. Granted, there were fewer of them. So I think there's an appetite. One of the things that I've really been looking at is the way in which people interact with art outside of museums. For example, there's a company in the outskirts of Philadelphia called SEI Investments that has a world-class collection of contemporary art. So people live near it, and they have open plan workspaces. All the desks are on wheels, and there are power cables that come out of the ceiling every so often. And literally, someone will work next to a life-size hand-sewn Hummer, or a wall covered in fiberglass poisonous mushrooms, or a pair of men's wingtip shoes that are made out of licorice and are 3 feet tall. So I think that there's this question of kind of art in everyday life, but I think there's a real dearth of opportunity for people to make work. And I've given a related talk in a corporate setting and had people draw, and you can feel the energy in the room change when people are given a marker and asked to look at each other and draw without staring at their paper. So I'd like to see more of it. If I had one recommendation from the book, it would be the importance of studio art, not just to museums, but to people's overall lives. Yes?
So you talk about the idea of museums with insulated judiciary. How can museums balance, I guess, how can they keep themselves from becoming too insulated in a way?
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
maintain that cycle of innovation and even from just saying that art is, well, the things we have, that's what art is,
Right. So this is a very related question about how museums keep themselves from becoming overly insulated too elite a judiciary. And it's a political structural question, and the answer has everything to do with more people making art. So for me, if you describe museums as a judiciary, then they're a political institution, and all political institutions in a democracy exist in relation to a notion of citizenship. So what I would say is that the idea of being a citizen of the art world is to be an artist oneself, not just to be an appreciator of art. So I would invite more and more people into the conversation around art and into the public debate around the role of museums and art in society. And I think, therefore, you get this countervailing force. You get an insulated judiciary on the one hand, and then you also get what the same founding fathers would have called factions on the other, this colliding molecules view of a lot of viewpoints. And I think we don't have that now, because there are a lot of exceptionally smart, curious, creative people who apply these first principles of art in other areas, but without it being connected to art as a discipline. I mean, art is as basic as writing or math as a mode of communication, but it's also interpreted as a rarefied disciplinary area. So exactly to your point, I think if more people participated in the conversation, that would counteract that worry.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about museums focused on like the big ticket items, like the blockbusters versus like continuing with their educational mission. I mean, one example that comes to mind is the Gross Clinic, the painting that was in a hospital in Philadelphia. Famous painting. They're going to sell it to Arkansas, but then the city banded together to raise money, and it was a big rallying cry. But that's just one painting that people are going to see in one room.
Right.
How do they expand and get traffic in other areas?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question of museums focusing their attention on blockbuster exhibitions and on single, famous, iconic paintings, and how to get people to put their attention elsewhere. Is that fair, Cliff? So I think part of this is just basic human psychology, that people like to respond to a crisis or go see a particular thing. I think museums are suffering in a way. They're really struggling to figure out how to appeal to a broad audience, and they think that one of the ways to do that is to have these masterpieces and these big exhibitions. There are a couple of quotations that I didn't read from the book about all the banners furling and unfurling in front of a museum as not a flush of health, but a flush of fever. And I think that you're exactly right. My feeling is that if museums, it's a chicken egg problem, but if they stopped having blockbuster exhibitions and they stopped feeling this need constantly to expand, which is a function of donors being excited by a concrete project or needing to coalesce the momentum of staff around something tangible. If people could wean themselves off of that temporarily and turn scholarly attention to their own permanent collections and create real information about other works of art. And if you didn't have to pay so much to go to a museum, so it wasn't structured like an all-you-can-eat buffet economically, you could champion the drop-in visit, and someone could go really feel invited to look at any work of art that appealed to them and kind of have it normed that looking at one thing or three things before you leave is totally reasonable. Much more perfume counter, much less all-you-can-eat buffet. So I think that what happens is that there's not a lot of information about other works in the collection because they spend so much time constantly hustling to get exhibitions off the ground. And they pay a lot of money for some of them, too. It'll cost $1 million to bring in a traveling show, just the fee to the organizing institution. So I think a lot of that's just psychology. It's the notion of betterment as opposed to the notion of growth. And I would love to see it happen. The only other thing I would suggest along those lines is there are some museums that justify expanding architecturally because they have so many wonderful works in storage. But what I think would actually be great is if they're only showing the top 5 or 10% of their collection, if they took the next 15 or 20% and sent it on a semi-permanent loan to regional museums, then I think there would be many, many more works of art for people to go look at. Because often you get this dynamic of a big blockbuster show coming to a regional city because they have work in their collection by major artists, but it might be third-rate work, and therefore they talk about it in terms of the importance of the artist overall, not just in terms of the actual work of art. But I would love to see more of that happen. So Pepe is asking if there are projects to create more virtual museums online. Yes, absolutely, very much so. A lot of museums, I think, see it as a chance to have a scholarly database. So they have a lot of material that's geared toward teachers. The Metropolitan, the Museum of Modern Art, the Tate, a lot of the big museums have exceptionally good databases. I don't think that so many of them have organized them as virtual tours because there's this whole question of the importance of seeing an original work of art. This is the same as the question of finding enough places to sit. If you didn't believe in the original work of art, museums could project up enormous copies of things and have tons of seats in the middle and everybody could see well enough. So I think they currently see it as a complement to and not a substitute for the work of art. But that's changed over time. If you had asked that question in 2000, 2001, there was tremendous excitement around monetizing their collections in that fashion to cross-subsidize other activities. So.
One other question. Are there things that the art museum world can learn from like science museums and like science industry and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. How much art museums can learn from science and industry museums? I think art museums, there's something that's always a little bit subjective about them. So if anything, they grow out of a tradition of science museums because the earliest instances of museums were scholarly cabinets of curiosity, or what are essentially libraries. And so they were taxonomic, and I think that comes directly from science museums. And if anything, I think art museums are experimenting with growing away from that tradition and embracing subjectivity more so. One of my favorite formats of exhibition is called Label Talk, where the Williams College Museum of Art does this under that name. A few other museums do it otherwise, where they invite lots of people to come in and write essays about the same work of art. So instead of a single, this is the scientific truth of this painting, you'll have 3 or 4 labels. Say it's a picture of George Washington. There'll be a historian, there'll be an artist, there'll be a scientist talking about how they would look at the painting. So I think if anything, they're growing away from it a little bit. We have time for one more question, or we can go ahead and wrap up? Yes?
Along the same thoughts of like a science museum or something, is there like increase in interactivity? I see like some museums might have information about screens or models to get them to understand what they're looking at. Is that something like that?
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's this question of increased interactivity in museum exhibitions. I think absolutely they do have that. There are a lot more computers in the galleries, and there are quite a number of companies that do exhibition design that focus on those kinds of whistles and bells. in my opinion, and I'm very old-fashioned this way, I prefer just to be able to sit in front of a work of art and for the work of art to speak on its own. A bench is an invitation to sit and to have information as much as I want. But the ways in which I've most enjoyed seeing computers used is to further a conversation. So there'll be computers where people can log anonymous comments that are then posted on the wall of the exhibition. So they're used to create a framework for a conversation, more so than this kind of whistle and bell. I think this is the kind of last slide of, if you take a Van Gogh painting and you shine a strobe light on it, it doesn't become this. And I think the same thing is true of having computers in the galleries. There's so much contemporary work that's made in that way. And absolutely, if the work is made out of computers, technology is integral. But I think there are natural limitations to feeling that putting a kiosk, with Van Gogh activities for children next to a Van Gogh painting, that can be great, but I don't think it's necessarily an end-all, be-all. I think having simply a piece of paper and a pen is often the most kind of revolutionary way of interacting that you can have. So I'll just close again by saying thank you so much for having me here. I'm very honored. And I care a lot about people's relationship to museums, but that's really because I care about museums' relationship to how people think as they're walking down the street on any given Tuesday. So I hope you embrace your own creative projects at work or otherwise, and that helps you enjoy museums and that museums help you enjoy those things. So thanks again very much, and I'll leave it there.